The decisive moment had passed, yet for Bruce Lee, victory did not feel complete. Witnesses later described a subtle shift in his posture of quiet tension that had not been present before the engagement began. He had proven his ability to dominate the opponent, but he could see where his method had faltered. It was not about the challenger. By every measure, the fight had ended in Bruce Lee's favor. What unsettled him was the time, the wasted motion, the moments when control had faltered, even slightly. In private, he replayed each exchange, noting every pause, every hesitation, every gap where efficiency could have been greater. This introspection marked the turning point. He did not speak about it, did not announce it, and certainly did not perform for the witnesses. Instead, he returned to the fundamental stance, speed, and economy of motion. He began to measure not just whether techniques worked, but how precisely they worked. Each movement was dissected, refined, and internalized. Students who trained with him shortly after the encounter recalled subtle changes. Exercises became sharper, simpler, and more deliberate. Sparring focused on adaptation rather than repetition. The principles of Jeet Kune, doing intercepting, minimalism, directness were emerging quietly, born from the dissatisfaction of a victory that felt incomplete. Witnesses noticed this quiet transformation, even if they could not articulate it. Bruce Lee's presence, once impressive for its skill, now carried an almost invisible intensity. There was control in his breathing, economy in his motion, and a psychological weight that surpassed raw physical dominance. The demonstration had been decisive, yet the lesson had been personal. It was a silent message to himself. Winning without refinement is insufficient. Observation and adaptation mattered more than approval or applause, even in victory. Bruce Lee had set a higher standard, one that no external validation could meet. And it was this quiet insistence on exactitude that would shape not only his system of combat, but his lasting influence on martial arts. After the engagement, Bruce Lee did not linger on celebration or acknowledgement. The room emptied, witnesses departed quietly, and the physical signs of the encounter faded. Yet in the stillness, he confronted the outcome with exacting scrutiny. He understood that winning the fight had proven competence, but it had also exposed his own limits. There were moments where his reactions had been slower than ideal, gaps in timing, and subtle inefficiencies in movement. These were not failures in the sense of defeat, but they were evidence that mastery required more than raw skill or speed. It required constant refinement and honest assessment. In later reflections recorded by his students, Bruce Lee emphasized that this experience reshaped his understanding of combat. Victory could not be measured by what an opponent could withstand. It had to be measured by how efficiently one could execute, how precisely one could act under pressure, and how consistently one could apply principles without compromise. The encounter also illuminated a psychological dimension of mastery. Control was not merely physical. It was a matter of mental clarity. Bruce Lee began to observe not just the mechanics of technique, but the patterns of thought behind them. Each hesitation, each decision, became a point of study. In essence, he treated the fight itself as a lesson in introspection. In the days following, he adapted his training accordingly. Forms were deconstructed, sparring sessions restructured, and new drills introduced to address the gaps he had noticed. This was not for show, nor to impress anyone. It was for the quiet pursuit of precision. Witnesses would later recall that his teaching style subtly shifted around this time, emphasizing adaptability, interception, and economy of motion, which became foundational to Jeet Kune Do. The realization after the win was simple, yet profound. Competence was not enough. True mastery required the relentless examination of one's own methods and the courage to refine them, even when the world had already judged the outcome. And so, the private reckoning began, a process that would quietly but permanently redefine his approach to martial arts. Years later, the fight in that small Oakland room remained almost invisible to the public, It was never recorded, never widely discussed, yet its consequences rippled far beyond that single encounter. For Bruce Lee, the victory was a turning point, not a conclusion. The private dissatisfaction he carried reshaped how he trained, how he taught, and ultimately how he thought about martial arts itself. Witnesses who remembered the encounter often described it not in terms of a clear winner or loser, but in the subtle changes they saw afterward. Bruce Lee's movements became more economical, his timing sharper, and his decisions more deliberate. Every gesture in class carried the imprint of that private lesson, that a fight could reveal hidden weaknesses even in apparent success. The principles that emerged from this introspection crystallized into what would become Jeet Kune Do. Adaptability, efficiency, directness. These were not invented in theory. They were distilled from observation, trial, and a quiet acknowledgement of imperfection. The fight had provided the blueprint, but the innovation was born in reflection, not confrontation. In later decades, students and observers noted a shift. In his teaching, less emphasis on rigid forms, more on practical application and responsive action. The encounter had taught him that mastery was a process, not a performance. The legacy of that day lived in classrooms, in the disciplined habits of his students, and in the very philosophy that reshaped modern martial arts. The room, now empty, had long ceased to matter. What endured was the subtle transformation it catalyzed. Bruce Lee had won the fight, yet he was unsettled, and it was that unease that carried forward, leaving a quiet but permanent mark on martial arts history. Victory had proved skill. Discontent had created a legacy. The fight ended with Bruce Lee standing, his opponent retreating, and the room in Oakland convinced the challenge was over. Witnesses would later agree on the result, even if they disagreed on almost everything else. Bruce Lee had won. Yet within minutes, he was unsettled, breathing hard, pacing, dissatisfied. What troubled him was not the opponent, it was the time it took. That quiet discomfort would outlast the victory, reshape his training, and alter the direction of modern martial arts without any public announcement that it ever happened. By the early 1960s, Northern California was not a neutral place for martial arts. It was divided quietly, without signs or public arguments, but with clear boundaries that everyone understood. Schools were small, lineages were protected, knowledge was passed selectively, often within ethnic or family lines. Reputation mattered more than numbers, and silence mattered more than publicity. Oakland, across the bay from San Francisco, was beginning to change. College campuses were growing, immigration patterns were shifting, Chinese communities were no longer as insular as they had been a decade earlier, but tradition still held authority. In many circles, teaching martial arts to outsiders, particularly non-Chinese students, was viewed as disrespectful, if not dangerous. Bruce Lee did not grow up inside this California system. He arrived from Hong Kong with a different background. Formal Wing Chun training under IP Man, early exposure to Western boxing, and a temperament that questioned fixed rules. By the time he began teaching in the Bay Area, he was young, outspoken, and unusually direct. He taught what he knew, and he taught anyone who was willing to work. This was not done quietly. Lee demonstrated openly. He spoke publicly about efficiency and realism. He challenged rigid forms not through insults, but through comparison. He showed what worked for him, and he allowed others to test it. Students came from different backgrounds. Some had never trained before. Others came from karate or judo schools. What drew them was not spectacle, but clarity. Lee moved differently. His training emphasized conditioning, speed, and practical application. There was little ceremony. There was no insistence on hierarchy beyond competence. Word traveled faster than Lee seemed to expect. Not through advertisements, but through observation. People watched classes. They listened to students talk. They noticed that Lee's approach did not align with established norms. He was not waiting for permission. Within the Chinese martial arts community, this created unease. Not outrage, at least not openly, but concerned. Teaching methods were being questioned indirectly. Authority, which had long been assumed, was now being compared. Bruce Lee was aware of the tension, but he did not retreat from it. In letters and later interviews, he would acknowledge that his approach unsettled people. At the time, he continued training, teaching, and refining his own understanding of combat. He believed that effectiveness justified openness. He believed that truth could withstand scrutiny. Others were less certain. By late 1964, the environment around Lee had become observant rather than welcoming. Conversations occurred without him present. Questions were raised about limits: who should teach, who should learn, and what happened when those limits were crossed. No public confrontation followed. No warnings were issued. Instead, the situation moved towards something older and quieter. A test, not a spectacle meant for crowds. A resolution meant for those who believed authority should be settled, once, in a room where witnesses would remember the result, even if they never agreed on the details. And Bruce Lee, knowingly or not, was already walking toward it. The challenge did not arrive as a threat. There were no raised voices, no formal notices, no public demands. That was not how these matters were handled. Among the senior figures watching Bruce Lee's rise, confrontation was understood as a corrective measure, not an act of hostility. Accounts differ on who first suggested it, but witnesses agree on the purpose. The situation was no longer about individual preference or teaching style. It was about boundaries. If Bruce Lee wished to continue teaching openly, the belief held by some was that he should first prove quietly, conclusively, that his methods justified the disruption they caused. A representative was chosen, not a champion promoted for spectacle, and not an outsider seeking attention. The challenger was selected because he carried the weight of tradition without needing to announce it. His presence alone was meant to reassert order. The terms were simple: no audience beyond a small group of witnesses, no rules beyond stopping when one party could no longer continue, no trophies, no public acknowledgement afterward. It was not framed as punishment. It was framed as resolution. Bruce Lee did not refuse. In later recollections, those close to him described his response as direct and unembellished. He accepted without protest, not because he felt obligated, but because he believed testing oneself was inseparable from growth. He did not request advantages. He did not attempt to control the conditions. The location was chosen for privacy rather than comfort. A school floor, limited space, enough room to move, but not enough to escape engagement. Those present understood they were there to observe, not to intervene. What made the moment unusual was its restraint. No speeches were given. No lineage was recited. No one attempted to intimidate the other. This was not a clash of personalities. It was a comparison of systems. Bruce Lee arrived as he always did, focused, alert, already warm from training. There was no visible tension in his posture. Those who knew him noticed something else instead. His attention was inward. He was not scanning the room. He was not seeking validation from the witnesses. He was preparing to work. The challenger carried himself differently. His confidence rested in what he represented rather than what he needed to prove. He had been sent to demonstrate sufficiency, not dominance. As they faced one another, the atmosphere remained subdued. No one expected chaos. The belief was that the outcome would be clear and that clarity would restore balance. Yet beneath that calm expectation lay uncertainty, not about who would win, but about what the encounter might expose. Because if Bruce Lee failed, the situation would resolve itself quietly. And if he succeeded, the question would not be whether he had earned the right to teach that, it would be whether the existing rules still mattered at all. The signal to begin was minimal. no command, just movement. And with that, observation replaced assumption. Those who were present later struggled to describe the atmosphere accurately, not because it was chaotic, but because it was restrained. The room did not feel like a contest space. It felt more like a place where something private was about to be confirmed. There were no spectators in the usual sense. The small group gathered along the edges understood their role. They were not there to cheer or judge technique. They were there to remember what happened. In case remembering became necessary, accounts agree on one thing. The moment the engagement began, the room changed. Conversation stopped, movement narrowed, attention fixed itself on the center without effort. Bruce Lee moved first, not aggressively, but decisively. He closed distance quickly, testing reactions rather than committing to a single line. This was consistent with how his students later described his training: probing, adaptive, unwilling to waste time establishing dominance through posture alone. The challenger responded with structure. His movements reflected formal training and discipline, grounded in maintaining balance and spacing. Early exchanges were brief and inconclusive. Hands met, contact was made and broken. Neither man attempted a dramatic strike. What unsettled some of the witnesses was not violence, but derision. The encounter did not resolve immediately. It extended. Bruce Lee pressed forward repeatedly, forcing engagement. The challenger retreated, not in panic, but in calculation, attempting to reset. The space began to feel smaller. Breathing became audible. Here, accounts began to diverge. Some recall grappling. Others remember prolonged chasing. There is disagreement over which techniques were applied and in what order. But the shared observation was this: the fight did not look efficient. Bruce Lee was winning ground, but not time. The longer it continued, the clearer it became that the outcome was no longer in doubt. The challenger's movement slowed. His structure broke down under pressure. Eventually, he disengaged completely, unable or unwilling to continue. The fight ended without ceremony. No one announced a winner. No one needed to. Bruce Lee remained standing. The challenger stepped away. The test, as it had been defined, was over. Yet the room did not relax. Those watching noticed Bruce Lee immediately afterward. He was breathing hard. His focus had shifted away from the opponent and inward, toward something unresolved. There was no visible satisfaction, no acknowledgement of success. For the witnesses, this reaction was unexpected. By the standards that had prompted the challenge, Bruce Lee had proven his point. He had demonstrated effectiveness under pressure. Authority, as it was understood, should have transferred. Instead, he appeared troubled. The room had received an answer. Bruce Lee had received a question, and that question would not leave him alone once the witnesses were gone.